Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we are joined by Attila Farkas, Director of Interoperability Solutions here at Infoway, who will be our main presenter, along with Russ Buchanan from Gevity, who has been working on this effort with Attila and will be here for the Q&A following the presentation. Prior to our presentation, I'll cover some administrative details here with our disclaimer. This webinar represents solely the views of Infoway. It is intended to be informative only and cannot be interpreted as providing any indication of Infoway's present or future strategies or investment criteria. Infoway does not implicitly or explicitly endorse any particular technology or solution of any vendor or any other person. It does not guarantee the reliability of any proposed results related to the use of such technology or solution, and this, notwithstanding that reference, may be made directly or indirectly to any such technology or solution in this webinar. With that, I'll hand things over to Attila, who will be presenting Accelerating Clinical Interoperability in Canada, the Standard Selection Process. Attila.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everybody. My name is Attila Farkas. As Peter mentioned, I'm the Director of Interoperability Solutions within the Clinical Systems Integration team. And the focus of today's discussion is work that we've undertaken to capture best practices in the area of standard selection. We're fairly excited by what we have in place, and we're looking for your input and support to make it better and build it out further. So please remember that what you'll see today is, as is usually the case with online services, is still work in progress. Some of the components are further along than others, so we would like to ask for your patience and understanding as the work progresses. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into the agenda. We'll begin by providing context for the work, then talk a little bit about the project and what it delivered, provide a demo, which is a walkthrough over the new content in InfoScribe, and then we'll discuss next steps and open the floor for your questions, feedback, and answer your questions. So, strategic context. You may remember that about 2 years ago, Infoway had launched the Clinical Interoperability Action Plan. The plan arose from stakeholder engagement, and the standard selection best practices was one of the items listed as an important topic as part of that plan. What we have heard at the time from stakeholder engagement was that clinical interoperability should be about improving patient care by increasing the value of clinical information and providing systems that are easy for clinicians to use. The role of standards, interoperability, is to improve sharing of information and improve workflow. So what this meant from a practical means in our context is that focus should not be on standards for the sake of standards. Rather, it is the interoperability that supports the clinical and business objectives. It is about doing things the same way so systems can work together. In other words, we need standardization. Given that, the emphasis is on packages of standards, interoperability specifications, implementation guides that make it easier to standardize on solutions. The community has expressed a very clear position. There was a need for standardized solutions, and the clinical perspectives need to be taken into account. This drove a movement towards creating recipes, not just a focus on ingredients. In other words, a shift from standards to their use as part of the standardization efforts. It is believed that a holistic approach that takes into account clinical requirements through standards to specification is the way to go. The Standard Selection Best Practices project embraced this paradigm. The final goal of the project was to make it easier to find information about existing specifications, share and reuse them, and where necessary, create new ones. So now let's take a closer look at the project, the approach, and components that were produced as part of it. So the objectives of the project were to identify, first and foremost, the best practices that are applicable, and then create some resources that the country could use, and we did not want to just create another white paper. We started by doing an international scan to understand what was done abroad. And then we filtered that from the Canadian perspective. We looked at ONC Standards Advisory, we looked at similar work in Australia and Europe, and also some Canadian work. So the analysis was very informative, and then it drove our design process, producing an approach that we wanted to test with the community. So with help from Gevity Consulting, we decided to go out and do a limited stakeholder outreach, asking a few questions to validate and test our assumptions, and also to gather other perspectives. Two themes came back very loud and clear. One was that there was a very significant gap in process maturity for standard selection in the country, across the country. Some jurisdictions seem to have very sophisticated means of selecting standards, whereas others have a less formal approach. So this reinforced one of the initial thoughts of the project, which was that we need to provide better process guidance. Almost unanimously, all respondents have expressed a strong desire to being able to access standard selection decisions and solutions done by others. So this feedback refined the second objective of the project, namely to build out the marketplace of solutions to interoperability problems. So I would like to specifically call out the immense help that we received from the from the standards team at eHealth Ontario in building out the guidance component that you will see shortly. So reusing one of the platforms that I mentioned in the beginning, InfoScribe, which was launched about 2 years ago, the project proceeded to try to model the end-to-end process of standardization. So what you see on the screen right now is a little hint, and we will go through the demo further. But for those that were involved in early days, especially in clinical requirements and specification work, you will be happy to see that not only those are not abandoned, but they're finally becoming intrinsic part of this end-to-end business. So what you also notice on the screen is that standards occupy a very central place in this paradigm, and they are supported, and they are providing support for the newly created standard selection component. So now let's look closer at the standard selection part. What you will notice is the two distinct elements I was mentioning previously. One was the standard selection guidance. This one focuses on describing best-of-breed approach to standard selection, and we will look at this closer. Second is what we internally call standard selection guide registry, because the name seems to imply, which it's meant to be, a collection of prior work done for national, jurisdictional, or even local matters. So this is the place where any new project should go to look before they start making any decisions. See what others have done, and feel free to use them. So the demo will, of course, cover this portion as well. So standard selection guidance. Let's talk a little bit about this. It's inspired by work done by our colleagues at eHealth Ontario, and it identifies distinct parts of a formal process that you can kind of see there as four-step process. We adapted this process slightly to help with creating content, and I will highlight every single component as we go on. Then, looking under the covers a little bit as a hint, we tried to keep the process very short and focused. You will notice that aside from a two-page description that help interpret the diagram, the rest of the guidance focuses on listing questions that all project teams should ask themselves whenever faced with standard selection decisions. So the proposed paradigm is based on a comparative assessment of various choices available for a problem space. Project teams usually identify a handful of possible standards to use for a problem. The guidance part serves up the question that will aid the discovery process in identifying how those choices fare when compared to each other. We also provide a template that helps users collect the answers to these questions and create a foundation that supports an even more formal, albeit internal approval process. In other words, we're proposing that this process can be done behind closed doors where people feel comfortable. However, it will help drive towards standardization. You will see in the demo how this looks like. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the second part, the registry. The registry is where rubber hits the road, basically. And we hope that this part will make the tedious process of standard selection a worthwhile investment, because it does contain summaries of work done by others already. So the idea here is that using a simple template, again, downloadable from the site, Project teams, once they reach their decision, can compile and post a few page summaries of what standards were considered, what the decision was, and what's the rationale for recommending their choice. I'd also like to mention, before we leave the subject, that the site is designed in such a way that it supports modern, real-time, collaborative, private or public authoring for these guys. So it's not just, let me upload this document and this is it. I think the demo will speak a little bit to that, but please keep that in mind. Okay, so since we're talking about this demo, might as well, let's just jump to it. Let's see if that comes up. Is it there? Perfect. So, InfoScribe. InfoScribe has been an addition to our tooling configuration from the beginning. About 2 years ago, we introduced it. It is connected with the rest of our components and is constantly being upgraded. What you are seeing on the screen currently is the way InfoScribe looks like when a registered person logs in into the system. I decided not to show you the unregistered aspect because, quite frankly, there's a lot of material here that's copyrighted, and because of that, you do have to have an Infoway account in order to access the details. However, even without having advanced credentials, you can still come in as a guest and be able to observe these things. So what you see in front of you is the pathway that the picture previously showed, and it is intended to sort of drive the users from the clinical requirements to drive out business requirements, and then investigate what standards would be supporting those ones by the aid of standard selection, and hopefully in the end ending up with specifications. It is our hope that in time, with content coming into InfoScribe, we will be able to serve up full interoperability bundles that will give you one single longitudinal view over a particular problem, starting from here, ending on this side. However, the focus for today's discussion is the standard selection part, and so I will immediately jump into that part. What you notice here in the top menu as well as the lower icon is that the content is organized into two categories. However, hitting the menu will bring you to the landing page. So these two choices are the ones that I mentioned previously, the guidance, which lists the process, and then the registry. So let's look at the process first. So the process is approached from two perspectives. One is providing some guidance into what are the most important steps to consider when approaching standard selection decisions. On the left side, it walks the user through a logical progression. The first part of the journey being a description of how a typical project usually unfolds, how from assembling the team, the requirements for the project are identified, stakeholders, there's an entire stakeholder swim lane here that focuses on their engagement, and then using input from those stakeholders, requirements are gathered, standards identification is undertaken, there's an assessment to this, and that is yielding an assessment report, which, as we marked here, is an internal to the organization. Once stakeholders agree that that's the chosen way, then an approved standard decision is posted to the project, and our ask is that that decision is also reflected into a standard selection guide. You will see both of these guides supported by templates a little bit later on in the presentation. What this diagram also shows is that throughout this journey, Infoway is offering support in the way of resources, online resources that users can draw upon. So this is the simple way of presenting the process, and as I mentioned, in 2 pages, pretty much the entire process is explained. It doesn't go into a lot of details, but I think it's fairly simple and straightforward. Then we are hitting the assessment criteria. So what does the assessment criteria really mean? It is part of the standards assessment where, after requirements have been identified, Now comes the time to judge the candidates against each other. What you see here is an approach where we're doing kind of a Q&A. We're looking at fit for purpose, we're looking at stewardship, quality, and then we're going to have certain standard-specific assessment. The entire format of the page is very easy to absorb, and pretty much at any time users can expand these questions, and the idea is that even though some may not be applicable to your particular solution, it is worth considering the question because it may spark discussions that are important for the project. Every single assessment criteria, be that generic or be that standard specific, is then driving the results being captured into the template that we're recommending here as an appendix. So typically what we would expect, a project team gets started, they download this template, and then they go over the assessment, and as part of that assessment, they are able to fill in sort of a weighted average of how the various standards that were considered, let's say they can list them here, what the weighted average of these standards is in the bigger picture. And they can arrive at an informed decision as to what the winner will be. Now, in some cases, we are aware, in some cases the situation is not black and white. And there may be reasons that certain choices here need to be overruled, and we are allowing for that, of course. And you will see when we're looking at Appendix B, which is the selection guide template, that we have made accommodation for such things. So the expectation is then that the project team would use this document and proceed to a formal, more or less formal internal process and arrive at a decision. That decision should yield a green light to proceeding to implementation. And what we're asking of the community is that participation in this forum should generate a very simple artifact, which is a few-page long document, and this document is meant to collect those decisions that have been made and what type of considerations led to those decisions. As you can see from the table of contents, we will look at actual examples of this. All we're really looking for is what was the purpose of the project, roughly the business context, high-level use cases, so that those that are investigating these later on can recognize whether this matches their problem. And then what were the standards evaluated? This would definitely help future implementers because they have no way of knowing if certain standards have been evaluated just from the recommendation. And then the recommended approach, of course. Any implementation resources that were generated during the project, and then finally a reference to existing implementers. So that's basically it. This is very simple. As I'm sure you'll agree, it is not a very onerous process. It is straight to the point. We do ask for your, and this will come up hopefully in the Q&A session, we do ask for your input into, once you read through the questions in these assessment categories, we do ask for your input to maybe enhance these, to come up with new ones, because frankly, these are all valid points of view, but that's not to say that these are the only ones that should be considered. And I think the closer we get to some agreement as to what is important, the sooner we will end up having specifications and guidance that is relevant to everybody. Okay, so jumping back now to the second part of the journey, which is the selection guidance. Sorry, that was the selection guidance. My apologies. The registry. The registry is designed in a different way altogether. The registry is meant to be an implementer's best friend. There's almost no talk on this page. What it is some controls that automatically pick up relevant standard selection guides that are posted to the site. And we have tried to organize them in such a way that certain metadata from these guides is immediately picked out and can be automatically formatted in these easy-to-consume tables. So what you see here, for example, some of the attributes of these guides are what is their maturity. And by that, we mean the maturity of the standard that they're referring to. And then what is the status of the document itself? Is it a published document, as in you can trust it, you can reliably start using it, or is it something that's still in draft state and it's still going on through change, right? So as we're hoping that this resource will start growing very shortly, because we're also adding new content and we hope that you will contribute with yours, we do have a very easy way to find your desired choice here just by simply getting to type something. So for example, if somebody was interested in foreign exam management, it just so happens that it's at the top of the list, but it might as well not be on the list at all. However, doing a very simple search, the system identifies right away the space, and it basically redirects the user to that particular place. So what you're seeing here is the actual end result of all this work. This is an example of a standard selection guide that has just been finished. It is representing years of collaboration by the diagnostic imaging teams on InfoCentral, and prior to that as part of the SWIGs. And I chose to start with this one because it's a very interesting mix of various standardization choices that they had to make decisions on. I will walk you through the guide structure because I think it's very important to recognize the components and what type of information they provide for you. What you will probably recognize on the left side from the presentation is the top level categories that we're interested in. So as I mentioned, what is the business context? What were the use cases, evaluated standards, and so on. These are pages as part of this guide, and so you can navigate directly to them, or you can consume them as part of this guide because they're all collected here. So the very first time you'll notice when you come in is it's this portion of metadata that is probably very, very important. One shows that the standards that are depicted here have reached a maturity level that's normative. This was a consensus-built guide, therefore the Pan-Canadian recommendation is attached to it, and the status is published, as in, although there may be small changes to the guide in the future, the content is already reliable enough that anybody could use safely. It's a little bit of information about what type of standards will you find in it, and then the fact that it's a national scope. The second part that's interesting is the key contributors. You can immediately see who has worked on the project, so in case you have questions, you can contact these people, or you will also see a very similar link to existing implementations where you will see the institutions that are using the solution. So then the purpose, very short again, purely down to business. Then the business context is explained, and a few typical use cases that the project has been looking at. And then we're looking at evaluated standards. What you notice in the evaluated standards portion is we start first by identifying what were the areas of standardization that the project was struggling with. And there were 3 in this particular case. So then for every single area of standardization, what we're proposing is a very brief extract. You see, this table is basically an extract from the Appendix A template that was collecting all the information about what type of standards did we evaluate, what were the recommendations, and so on. And we tried to do also a little bit of a visual because sometimes the yes and no, it's not really telling the story. We wanted to accommodate percentage. So for example, if you were considering the DICOM standard, it's a lot less than the IHE was able to help the solution in this particular case. So then the table ends up with a recommendation, and this repeats 3 times for the 3 standardization choices. And then all these choices then are collected together in the recommended standards. So this is basically it. At this point, anybody that's interested in foreign exam management could just come and consume the recommended standard portion if they didn't care about anything else, and they would see what this particular implementation team has recommended. Then we have an implementation resources section where this will grow broader and more rich over time, because what we are trying to do here is not just put links to the community pages where people are talking about this subject, but rather to start bringing in meaningful connections with our tooling that were constantly evolving. In this particular case, we just showed that these were the codes that the team has decided on using, but in the future we see that in case this particular one was using fire profiles, for example, then those fire profiles could be presented in a fire browser here, or if they had value sets from the terminology service, that could also be served up in such a place. And then in the end is what implementations are currently, known implementations are currently using this. So yeah, so that's basically it. The entire guide, when printed, is about 4 to 7 pages, and it can be exported from this drop-down by export to PDF. So for all the ones that are already published, we are supporting this feature. I will apologize in advance for the format of it. We're still working on a little bit of JavaScript and some style sheets in the back end to make sure that the rendering is proper. Unfortunately, this table that presents the choices does not render very well just yet, but it's just a minute nuisance. I'm sure you'll appreciate that. So yes, so this was an example of a foreign exam of a standard selection guide. Now going back to the registry, I will also draw attention to another aspect, and that aspect is evolution of a particular problem space. In particular, we primed the registry with 3 standard selection guides for the same problem space, public health. So what you see here is probably those that are hands-on with standards will recognize the CRAX and MR immunization packages and know that CRAX has been one of the first ones to come out in early mid-2000, 2007, I believe. And later on, the MR package tried to bring up the level of clarity with some of the data sets and whatnot that were used in it. And so what we were trying to do here is to provide an avenue for users to be able to tell that even for the area of public health immunization, there's various proposals that are all potentially recommended depending on where you started. So if you were one of the early adopters and you did CRAX, you will be happy to know that it is still listed as published and is normative. It's superseded by another one. So in case your system is better adapted to using the MR package, and that's the standing recommendation as a pan-Canadian standard. Which is not to say that there's this other example that we're listing here, which is work that's currently going on in Ontario. It is a pilot project that is not just a pilot, it's going to proceed probably to full production, run by the Ministry of Health from Ontario, and it is also in the area of immunization. And in this particular case, they chose fire as one of the standards to go forward with, and we wanted to show that reality of life is that in certain cases you will not be able to choose the pan-Canadian recommended standard, and that the pan-Canadian recommended standard should be a living thing. In other words, if we start sharing our selection guides, then people will see that something exists and they will not be forced to invent their own thing. So the next province that is thinking about adopting a panorama implementation for immunization might want to look seriously at this particular guide and pick up the work that they are currently doing. So I think I will stop here with the demo. I mean, there's a lot more to be said about it, obviously, when it comes to how do we post to this and so on. But I would like to be able to finish up the presentation by drawing out the fact that our objective is exactly that, to encourage standardization by sharing. So I think it's probably the best thing to be able to start the discussion, to have it in the forefront of our daily life, and to be open about our choices, not to be afraid about some decisions because they're tough. But what's more important is that once you made that decision, you may be able to help somebody else. So we're really looking forward towards towards increasing this resource, the questions that are being asked, and the quality and the quantity of these guides that are getting processed. And hopefully you do see the value in the back-to-back legal specifications through requirements to final specifications, and you will participate in this. So at this point, I think we could talk about next steps. Next steps would definitely be try to get in touch with us, bring your projects, start working on online resources at the very least for projects that you have undertaken. Please take the time to create a standard selection guide and submit it for the bigger good. And I think I'll open up for discussions because I think you have probably a ton of questions.
Great, thank you, Attila. And as noted to everyone, we'll be using the chat function that you have on the WebEx screen. So if there should be a small window open at the bottom right of your WebEx interface, but if it's not there yet, there's the chat button that is at the top right. You'll be able to open it up and direct your questions towards me. I think that's your main option on the chat function, and I'll relay them to both Attila and Russ. So feel free to ask questions. Put you on the spot. I know it might take a couple of minutes, so we'll certainly wait out until we have a couple of questions that come through. And as we are, okay, we do have a first question. The first question is from Linda, and does the template have specific criteria for terminologies?
Thank you, Linda, for the question. Most definitely. Let me go into the guidance section once more and probably navigate from here, because this way you will notice what the content of the guidance shows, and then that is reflected one-to-one in the template. So the idea is this is general assessment criteria. General assessment are certainly not terminology specific. However, we do have a section that does look at standard specific assessment criteria, and that is space number 2. And here it is, terminology standards criteria, and you have an entire list of terminology-specific questions, the level of granularity of which changes from question to question, obviously. And the possibility here, again, is if we run across anything that we haven't thought of, it's very easy to expand. By the way, all these questions are mirrored in the template, so if you're reading through these and you want to include them in your assessment, you certainly can.
I think picking up just slightly on what Attila said, this is Russ Buchanan. So what you're looking at on the site is actually its inception is with work that eHealth Ontario did. I can't speak to what was prior to that necessarily, but what we did is work through some of their existing selection criteria that they've been using on their projects, bring some of it out of a specific Ontario perspective and bring it up to where it would be more generally usable to the community. And I think one of the big asks here is that this is really a drive toward a collaborative site, right? So taking in some of this and exercising it in your projects and then providing feedback back to Attila and Infoway related to the criteria is the way to involve this. So it provides more value back to additional projects. Like a goal here throughout is the idea that by contributing back, you increase the value of the resource for everyone, for your team through the reuse of your work, and for everyone else.
Great. We do have some other questions coming in, so I'll pass those along. So our second question, is it required to complete the selection guidance before a specification can be entered into the registry, or can a finalized spec be entered into the registry without providing the selection guidance?
Thank you for the question. That's a very good question. I meant to talk about it even before, and I totally forgot. My apologies to the folks from Alberta. We have just received extremely good work from Alberta Health and Sierra Systems, who have been working on the provider registry. So, for example, this is a project that was implemented in 2012, meaning they have already done all their analysis at the time and did the implementation. Therefore, this site obviously wasn't available at the time. Nevertheless, by and large, they did probably the same due diligence that we're suggesting here. And I think, Russ, you can attest to this. Once we received the information from that team, it only took you a couple of hours to translate what they have done and what they have learned in the process into this guide. And as you can see, this guide holds an Alberta recommended market guidance because it is a jurisdictional recommendation. They have started off from the Pan-Canadian Provider Registry package. For some reason, they had to do certain adjustments to that to further restrict it, and all those are represented in their criteria, reasoning, and explanation there. So yes, the answer to your question is you do not have to finish your assessment, especially for solutions that already exist. Instead, just collect the notes that you had and fill out the guide, or work with us, and we can online create a guiding document for the solutions that you currently have. Russ, anything to add?
I think the small addition I'd make is like one real goal here is to create a repository of decisions that were made so that folks can actually see what has been implemented out across the country and understand what the standards involvement in those solutions are. So the key thing in getting information back into the repository is really to capture the what of what was decided, but where the extra value comes through in at least trying to create the decision partially is really to bring forward what other options were on the table sufficiently for people to understand what the alternatives were and why this was the preferred alternative in that context. Because like in this case, like when you look at the PR, one of the key things that came forward in it and was learning for me is that first, there was extensions to the Pan-Canadian extension that were made to support business requirements associated with the RIC registry, and that was an interesting thing to know and capture. Another thing that was interesting to know and capture was the fact that the feeder systems to the registry are using a different specification, and understanding the rationale for that provides some useful information for somebody else down the road who's trying to evaluate the spec.
Exactly. And another aspect that's also very relevant is, especially for this, which is an existing implementation, we already have the ability to start tying in some of the actual APIs that have been used in the process, and following the links will take you there. I'm not going to spend any more time on this particular one, but I hope it answers the question that yes, you can certainly create a guide without formally having gone through the assessment process.
Great, thanks. And we do have another question, a very straightforward one. If I want to browse what you have shown today, is it available?
Yes, all these guides are currently in the public domain. As I mentioned earlier, given that we are making reference to standards, the only requirement there is that you have to have an InfoCentral account, but that's the only requirement. Once you have your InfoCentral account, single sign-on will sign you into InfoScribe, and you can go ahead and start browsing them. At this point, we only have these 5 that are in public domain. Over the next little while, we are planning on adding a lot more because we do have an extensive library of Pan-Canadian standards that used to be published, if you remember, in the old wiki. And we are also planning on bringing over content that will live on this particular site under the standards icon there, if you remember, in the pathway. So yeah, look forward to this being an active space that will grow by the day, pretty much.
Yeah. So one follow up on that was just to ask you exactly how you find the guide. So maybe like from startup, maybe from InfoCentral or somewhere. How do you get from one place to the next? Okay,
that's a very good question. Thank you. We are planning on integrating this new feature into the federated search that we currently have on both Infoway's central website and InfoCentral's. Right now, it's not part of the federated search. However, the links to coming into InfoScribe are available in the resources and tooling section of InfoCentral. I'm going to load that site just to be able to show you where that is. And then once you hit InfoScribe, or you can do a simple Google search for InfoScribe. I noticed this is the first thing that comes up. But under resources, you will notice that InfoScribe is the first one. So visiting this page is going to redirect you to the specifications or whichever space you're interested in. Yes. Anything else?
Yep. Well, and just maybe to follow up on that, we will be having any follow-up discussion around the standard selection process will be hosted on the Interoperability Solutions community. So for those that aren't on that community as of yet, that's a good one to join, and that will be a starting point where we'll post the slides for this meeting and such, and where you can start. You could ask questions if you don't have them today. You maybe think of something tomorrow. Feel free to ask them there, and Attila and Russ will certainly keep an eye on that community activity, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So just wondering, also wanted to see what people thought, and who out there might be considering to be a contributor.
Do we want to open up the lines maybe?
Yeah, so I think because we've gotten through the main presentation, what I'll do is I can unmute everyone, and we'll see how it goes. I'll see how best we can. There are quite a number of people on the line, but hopefully it'll be okay. So as I'm unmuting, if you don't have much to say and you feel you might interrupt by accident, feel free to mute yourself, but otherwise we'll be starting to hear from people in a moment. So here we go.
Those organizations who may be interested in participating, who would the contact be?
Could you repeat, because the unmute happened slightly after you started talking.
Yes, it's Sherilyn. For those jurisdictions or organizations who would be interested in participating, who would the contact be?
Thank you for the question. We should have talked about this. I should have mentioned it. Unfortunately, it was cut off by the screen. As you can see at the bottom of the registry, we are showing the email that you could use in order to send us any questions that you have in case you want to get in touch with us or in case you want to submit your guide. And then we can follow up through that. If you are sending an email to standards@Infoway, that creates a ticket in the system, and it will be a formal process initiated. So you can rest assured that we're not going to lose your email.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And there is another question just that came through the chat, so I'll ask that one directly. Is there an expectation that vendors provide their specifications?
That's a very interesting question. To tell you the truth, we haven't really thought this through to the point where we think of every single scenario, but I will go back to the founding principle of this approach. So what we're trying to do here is to give people a chance to see what type of solutions are out there for the EHR in Canada. So we don't want to turn this into a soundboard for vendors advertising their products. What we're really looking forward to is to see projects that local health authorities have undertaken, and if vendor solutions are part of the solution, by all means, they should be listed in there. Just like I was showing you the provider registry, Alberta Health is the champion of that project. However, Sierra Systems was part of the delivery mechanism, and their contact information appears in the guide. So in case folks from other jurisdictions would like to get in touch with them because they would also want to have one, there you go. You have the ability to do that. I hope that answers the question.
Great. And any further questions or comments?
Hi there.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, it's Yaron Derman from eHealth Ontario. Does the registry provide information about which version of a particular standard is being used, just because the recognition that there are updates to version 3, FHIR, and things like that, just so people are aware which version was selected? Very good question, Yaron. Thank you.
It really does, but it is up to the implementer of that particular version to specify. So if I go back again to the provider registry example, I think it becomes very clear which part of which version of the V3 package at the time was considered and how that got augmented by their particular version, by their changes. So we're not really enforcing anything. As you can see, it's relatively free text. I will say this, however, our desire, and it's a very strong desire, unfortunately, it takes a lot of time and effort to build these systems out, but our desire is to drive towards an implementation support with tools where if you do have a package that you have used as part, be that a fire profile or be that a V3 package, to be able to online consume it as part of this guide. In other words, we do have HR7 Explorer, for example, that would be suitable for browsing the message content, and we're working towards constantly improving our fire tooling in order to be able to position value sets or profiles that are being developed for these solutions. And we're hoping that a profile browser, for example, could be an integral part of such a guide, in which case it becomes very clear which one it was that it was used.
Great. Any further questions or comments?
Okay, so if there are no further questions, I would like to reiterate our call to please don't be shy, come forward with your solutions. I know that you're sitting on a huge mountain of goodies, and a lot of people are probably keen and eager to see these successful implementations, and let's get together, let's try to push standardization. And I hope that the platform will be there to support everybody.
Great. All right, thanks, Attila, and thanks, Russ. What we'll do is we'll make sure that we get things posted to the Interoperability Solutions community. And what we might do as well, since we have your emails from logging in, we'll email you directly to let you know when things are posted on that community, and you can start discussions from there. So thank you very much for everyone for attending today, and look forward to collaborating further. Thank you very much.